We are so thrilled to welcome Dr. Brian Turner from WDFW's Aquatic Invasive Species Unit. Well, currently up to his neck in European green crabs, he has also monitored mussels, corralled clams, neutralized nutria, sought snails, and identified insects. He's an avid science communicator and former professor at Portland State University. Brian is always happy to get out of the office and talk with folks. So be sure to say hi. Today, you'll learn about the European green crab and why it's making headlines as one of the most prolific invasive species in the world. We'll start with their origins and then move on to concerns and then what you can do. You all excited?
Hello, everybody. Let me see if I can adjust this. There we go. As it was mentioned, I'm Dr. Brian Turner. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Research Scientist at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I have as many words as possible in my title. So I'm going to be talking about various things about green crab today. Let's see if I can figure out how this works. It wants to work for me. Yes. Maybe it's up. There we go. So just to start off, please edit for those of you here in person. Feel free to take pictures. Some of the stuff I'm going to be showing you is how to identify green crabs. Some of it's going to be information on the website and other resources. So please feel free if there's anything you want to. All right, just a brief overview of what we'll cover. I'm going to do a start off by explaining what are aquatic invasive species. I'm sure many of you are aware already, but it's always nice to set that baseline. We'll talk specifically about the European green crab, how they got here, their history in Washington, why do we care, what's currently being done, and how you can get involved. There we go. All right. So what exactly are aquatic invasive species, or we often just refer to them as AIS? It's essentially any aquatic organism that's been introduced to an area it's not historically present. I know that's sort of a vague term, and that's because it's a human concept, not a biological concept that you can measure. But I want to specify that in Washington, when we talk about aquatic invasive species by law, we're specifically talking about animals. Plants are considered, noxious weeds and things like that, so it doesn't fall under the same legislation. That doesn't mean they're not a problem. It just means it's not my job to deal with. The other thing about aquatic invasive species is they need to cause some sort of trouble. If they are just not native to here, we usually don't care as much. It's not as much of a concern. But some of the things they do is they can outcompete native species. They can spread disease. They can alter ecosystem function like nitrogen cycling. They can have negative impacts on recreation. So a lot of places, if there's a lot of invasive species, sometimes that can diminish your desire to go there and recreate. And it can impact the aesthetic value of the area. So a really common species that a lot of folks may be familiar with is nutria. If you're not familiar with them, they're just a really big rat, but they are very common throughout the Pacific Northwest. I do want to take a moment to talk about classification because I am a scientist and we love to classify things. In Washington, the aquatic invasive species are split into two broad categories. They're either prohibited or regulated. If they're prohibited, they fall into one of three categories. The most extreme version is something called the prohibited level 1. This is defining a species based on its high risk, high potential for impact. I should point out it doesn't actually have to be in Washington to be classified as such, but a lot of them are. For example, coagula mussels and zebra mussels are not yet found in Washington. We're looking very carefully for them, but they are still a prohibited level 1 species. Prohibited level 2 is very similar, but may require some long-term site management. There are no legally classified prohibited level 2 species. It's just a status that exists. And then prohibited level 3 is they're considered a risk, but depending on the circumstances, we may or may not respond to it in different manners. So an example would be the African clawed frog here. Okay, the main thing about the prohibited ones is they're illegal to move or transport or release without permit from WDFW. It's just a no-go. Regulated are a little different. These are essentially the ones that are non-native, but we see some sort of benefit to them. So for example, regulated type A are any non-native fish classified as food or game. So if people are catching them or allowed to catch them and eat them, they are regulated. Regulated type B is basically anything that would otherwise go into A, but we don't eat, and is mostly for pet trade and aquarium. And then regulated level C is everything else. So an example of, say, regulated B is a goldfish. They're a non-native species. There are efforts sometimes to remove them from locations because they are a pest, but they're also legal to sell at the pet store. In those cases, you can have regulated species, but you're not allowed to release them into the wild without permission. I just want to take this second to discuss the fact that the Aquatic Invasive Species Unit at WDFW is a very large, or it's a growing unit. We are at, I think, about 30 people. We just hired on 2 new folks. One of my colleagues is in the back there. And so we handle, again, everything related to aquatic invasive species within the state. Some of that is specific to zebra and quagga mussel monitoring. Some of it's very specific to green crab. Others is ballast water, decontamination procedures. There's a wide array of things we deal with. So if you ever have any questions about anything related to aquatic invasive species, you should always feel free to reach out to our unit, and we can get you either in touch with the right person or help you directly. All right. Unfortunately, my fading of the text didn't work here, but we are at the second step of what are European green crabs. So I'm going to teach you the 5 points of European green crab identification. And oddly enough, the first point is they have 5 points. So European green crabs actually have 5 very distinct spines. They're also called carapace teeth on either side of their body. If you're familiar with other crabs like Dungeness, you might know that they have 10, with the biggest one being the very last spike on either side. But the green crabs are the only one on this coast that has the 5. They also are fairly small crabs. They don't grow much larger than 4 inches at all. Some of them get to be a tiny bit bigger, but generally they're smaller than 4 inches across. They also have 3 bumps right between the eyes. These are called rostral bumps. And if you look at, say, like a Cancer productus or a red rock crab, you'll see they have these really big kind of forehead bulge going on. The green crab only have those 3. They also have these 2 semi-flat rear legs. It makes them a little different from the cancer crabs that you might be used to seeing. It's very specific to their particular type of crab, that kind of flattened back leg. It allows them a really minimal amount of swimming power, but they're not great swimmers. It's more like a controlled fall. And then lastly, one inaccurate name, because they're not always green. In fact, they tend to be green when they are freshly molted, so when they most recently shed their exoskeleton. And as time goes on, it darkens into a yellow and then kind of an orange to even a dark red. So you don't want to rely on color as an identification factor. And in fact, one of my favorite things is there was a paper done several years ago by a researcher, and they made a green crab color chart. If these look familiar to you, these are actually paint swatches from Walmart. And so they used that as the basis for it. Unfortunately, the picture is not very high res, but some of them are like banana blast and things like that. So we have to be very precise when we want to classify some of these colors. All right, so now that you know how to ID a green crab, why don't you take a look? One of these is the European green crab. 3 of them are native crabs that are commonly reported to WDFW as green crab. And I want to note, though, we love getting reports that are wrong. We want people to be looking for them and letting us know what they see. So take a moment to look, and I want you to raise your hand if you think crab A is the European green crab. Crab B, crab C, and crab D. You guys are all great at this. That is, in fact, the European green crab. This one here is the hairy helmet crab. As you can see, it's got a very similar coloration. It also just looks really weird. And so we get lots of calls of like, I found some crazy thing in my trap. I don't know why the person calls sounds like that, but just go with it. But it isn't, if you look, the carapace teeth are a little different. It doesn't have really, it has kind of have the flattened legs, but it doesn't have the 3 bumps. It's not got the right shape. They're about the same size, though, I would point out. This is the hairy shore crab. These guys are super common. If anybody goes and flips over any rock, if you go to the water right now and flip over a rock, you'll find them. They're super common, but they do often get mistaken because they can be kind of greenish in color and they're small. And then lastly is the northern kelp crab. One of my favorites. Again, it's got that spidery appearance that people think must be something weird. And also they can be very green in color when they're young. They turn the color of the algae they eat. So as they age, they actually start eating red algae. And so that color difference is more distinct. But when they're small like this, they're about the same color. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how they got here. So green crabs are actually native, as the name suggests, to Europe. They're also up to Norway, down into West Africa as well. They have a pretty wide native range. And they were introduced, or I should say, one thing about invasive species is we often use a phrase like they were introduced when, but the reality is it's when we found them. There's often something called a lag effect where something arrives and it takes a while to find it. And so we don't really know when they got here, but the first recorded record of them on the East Coast was in 1817. So we know they've been there at least that long. The thought is they probably made it over back when they used to use solid ballast. So instead of like chugging water on board, you'd have these barrels just full of stuff that you shoveled off the shoreline, and that would be used to ballast the ship. And then when you get to the place you're going, you just dump it all out. You're not thinking about what's in there. They then were found near San Francisco in 1989. There's a couple of different ideas of how they might have gotten here, but the prevailing theory right now is they were probably part of bait packaging. It used to be that you would take bait and you would wrap it in algae and then ship it. And the idea is when they're little crabs, you might not notice them. You wrap them in algae, making them a nice, wet, cold place to live for the nice, fast journey on train or on plane to the other coast. And then when you unpack the bait, you just throw the algae into the ocean, and there you go. It's possible they made it through ballast water in some other way. It's also possible they made it through the Panama Canal through, again, ballast water. It could be some person just flew there and threw them out. We really don't know. But the prevailing theory is the bait. Once they were introduced in California, though, it's just a matter of their larvae traveling up the coast on the currents. And we've seen the northward trend ever since their introduction back in the 80s. They were first detected, I should point out, in Washington in 1980. This is probably a slightly outdated map of the green crab distribution. The blue is their native range. Red is where they're introduced and established. That means they have reproducing populations that are going to keep going if nothing happens. Green is potential areas, and the black circles represents they found a crab, but then like nothing really came of it. A lot of invasions don't succeed. I should say now their most northern expansion on the west coast here is into the most southerly parts of Alaska, which is really unfortunate, but that's happened in the last year. And Alaska Fish and Game is very concerned about this, as well as the various tribal nations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about history of green crabs here. Like I said, they got here in 1989, but what have they been doing since then? So as I mentioned, they were first found in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor in 1998. When they were first found, there was a general interest in monitoring and seeing what's going on. Just to point out, all these yellow squares are places where we have trapped. It's outdated. We've trapped in many other places, but it's not. And so you can see, there were about 364 crabs caught that year. The numbers went down and down. Only 24 were trapped in 2003. It was a concern, but it's hard it's hard to get the money going and the momentum going when people were like, oh yeah, there's 23 crabs, who cares, right? We unfortunately didn't learn our lessons from other places, but that is pretty common in the invasions world. I should also point out I've only been working in this for WDFW for 2 years, so there was, however, a thing that really sparked concern in 2012, where they were found in Sook Basin in British Columbia as an established population. They were set there. And so there was still some monitoring going on, again, very low numbers of crabs. But what really became a problem was in the following years. So we started getting more and more detections over time in more and more places. So up in the San Juan Islands and the Lummi Sea Pond in 2016, in parts of, I believe that's Dungeness Spit and the Macaw Bay in 2017, found even further up in Puget Sound in 2019, and the numbers just started going up. This one here in 2021, I want to point out, this was also the start of removal efforts by the Lummi Nation in their sea pond, and so that's one of the reasons why the numbers suddenly just went up. It's not, we were doing the same level of trapping, and all of a sudden there were 100,000 crabs. You have to take into mind how much is being worked. But this is still not good, right? So we suddenly got way more crabs in way more places. And that led up to the declaration. I should say that various tribal nations, such as Macaw Bay Indian Tribe, Shoalwater Bay Tribe, Indian Tribe, Lummi Nation, others put forth, along with WDFW, that this was a real concern and something needed to be done. And so in 2022, Governor Jay Inslee signed an emergency proclamation telling WDFW to take emergency efforts necessary to reduce or eradicate populations to protect resources in Washington. I am not going to make you memorize this chart. I just wanted to put this as an example of something called an incident command system. And you may have heard of this. It's a system that's been set up basically to deal with any sort of situation, but it's primarily used to manage emergency situations, like a fire or an earthquake or a flood. It basically standardizes how the chain of command works, how many people are allocated to work with different groups. Like if you start to have too many people, you have to form a new unit. It allocates responsibilities and resources in a consistent way. This is the first time the incident command system has been utilized for an invasive species response, because we're talking about a statewide response. And I want to make something clear. The response that's happening in Washington is unprecedented in the United States, and I think pretty much anywhere. There have been very limited efforts in other places to deal with green crabs. And I want to stress that our colleagues on the East Coast have put in many years of work trying to deal with green crabs, but the scale and amount of resources, both in terms of labor and money that's been thrown into it in Washington, is unprecedented. And so this system was used to help manage and keep things organized as we're dealing with a statewide emergency. All right. So, okay, I talked about green crab, you've seen a green crab. I said they're here. Why do we care? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, as my dad always put it, they are ugly suckers, and so you don't really like them. But the main reason, I don't go into aesthetics in judging animals, but there's a couple of reasons. These guys are really generalists in the broadest sense of the term. They can tolerate a really wide set of conditions. So they can tolerate really cold temperatures as well as warmer temperatures. They can tolerate a really wide range of salinities, so almost freshwater to very marine systems. They also have a very diverse diet. It's kind of hard to see actually, but I almost put the illustration in. But green crabs actually have two different types of claws. One's a little beefier, that's more appropriate for crushing prey, and one that's just a little narrower, that's more of a peeler kind of claw, and that allows them great versatility in terms of what they can consume. They're still small enough they can't eat everything, but they can eat a lot. They also have lots of babies. See if I can try to go back. Nope, I can't go back. Can I? Yes. Okay. This is what we call a gravid or buried female. That is her egg clutch. It varies from crab to crab based on things like size and how healthy they are, but they have approximately 180,000 eggs per clutch. Now, most of them die, to be fair. If you have that many babies, most of them are not going to make it. But if you have 180,000 babies and you do that multiple times in your life, and if the weather is good enough, multiple times a year, that's still a lot of babies. And so it doesn't take a lot of green crabs to allow for a continuing population, provided those larvae actually recruit back to the population. And then just so you know, this is what a larval green crab looks like. There's actually a lot of research being done right now up in Padilla Bay by the Padilla Bay Natural Estuarium Research Reserve. And they have been doing a lot of green crab larvae identification, which you'd think we'd know how to do that really well, but in fact, it's still pretty new. They also have had some pretty significant impacts to some pretty well-known species. This is the best documented cases, but they had a real strong impact on softshell clam harvests in Maine back in the mid-1900s. Wow, that makes me feel old to say that. Softshell clams also in Massachusetts. They've also had impacts in Tasmania and in Australia, and even in on the west coast here, we've had records of them having a really strong impact on these little guys called nutricula or dwarf Venus clams. They're very common small native species, but green crabs caused a tenfold reduction in their abundance in Bodega Harbor when they were introduced. Their impacts on crabs are a little less well known. They'll eat them for sure. And I've personally observed them eating a variety of small crabs. There's not a lot of things documented. And I want to stress there is the potential for them to be impacting things like Dungeness, but we really just don't have the information to say what kind of an impact there is. We can say a green crab will definitely eat a smaller Dungeness, but they'll also eat smaller them. So it's not exactly an exclusive situation. They also really like eating hairy shore crabs. This is also a population that really declined in Bodega Harbor, California after the green crab introduction. Some studies have shown that green crabs can outcompete Dungeness juveniles that are the same size for food and for shelter, so that may be having an impact. But again, that's in the lab, so we can't say for sure what the exact nature of it is in the wild. In terms of eelgrass, they seem like they eat a little bit of it, but the main impact is they will burrow into it for clams and other things to get the food they want. So there have been records in Canada of them decreasing eelgrass patches through this digging process. And there are real concerns about how they might affect shorebirds and salmonids. All right. So this is the big one here. This is the longest section I got here. I'm going to tell you about what's actually happening here in Washington and what's being done to address this problem. One thing I want to make abundantly clear is that this is not a WDFW project alone. We've put a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of work has gone into this by WDFW, but this is something that would be impossible to do alone. Tons of work is being done by many tribal nations. Lots of work is being done by other agencies such as, oh my gosh, now I'm blank, DNR, which I can't think of the acronym for, Department of Natural Resources, thank you, me. As well as national agencies like US Fish and Wildlife. There are also just other organizations that have joined in that when they have the resources and capability, they join in and help manage it. So I just want to make it abundantly clear how much help is going on and how big of a project this is. And it makes sense too, because green crabs don't respect political boundaries or jurisdictions, and so they will go where they want to go and do what they got to do. And so we have to work together to try to tackle it. And the situation is very different from place to place. To help address this, we've actually split the state up into various sections. So we have two broad branches, the Salish Sea branch and the coastal branch, divided up here by the most western point of Washington. And then it's been subdivided into 14 management areas. These are mostly broken down by our marine fisheries boundaries. It's a little different than that because we want to make sure we adjust it for different jurisdictions and things like that. And then within those, it's further subdivided. I'm not going to try to show you a map of every single sublocation, but if you're interested, I can tell you about it later. So within the state, there's a lot going on, but I'm going to describe the three most common actions that are going on. First is early detection. The goal of early detection efforts is to find green crab as soon as we can at a location. Ideally, it's as soon as they arrive. Realistically, it's as soon as they're at a high enough density that whatever effort we're putting into it, we find them. That could mean that we caught them a week later. It could mean we caught them 2 years later. We really can't say. It just depends how intensely and how frequently we check. The rationale for this is that as soon as we find them, we can take action. The earlier we find a population, the more likely we can actually do something about it. And there's a lot of different tools that are being used. I will say the primary tool we use for green crab management in Washington is trapping. But for early detection work, there's also eDNA sampling, which is it's a complicated way to approach it, but it can help us find things where we might not normally spot it. There's also molt searches. So there are programs where people walk along the beach looking for the shed skeletons of the crab to report in. And then larval sampling through light traps and benthic samplings, or not benthic sampling, sorry, larval toes. So basically take a net, swab it through, see what you catch. And this is happening anywhere that green crab haven't been detected. To be fair, there's not, though, too much of this early detection in a place like Willapa Bay, where green crab are really well established. But it's much more common in the Salish Sea branch, where there's lots of areas where green crab are not yet present. Then we have control. The goal of control is just to get rid of as many green crab as possible, bring that population down in order to protect the resources and species that are important to us in Washington. These could be, a particular species that we're trying to protect. It could be particular habitat. It could be a cultural resource, whatever it is. The goal is to get them down to a level where they won't have an impact, or at least a less of an impact. Right now, the only current tool available is trapping. There are other options that exist. There's certain legal and logistical reasons why some of these tools can't be used. And then there's some ideas that have been floated to us that are like robots swimming around and catching the green crab that are not quite there yet. This is basically happening anywhere green crab have been established, which is primarily in the coastal areas like Willapa Bay, Grace Harbor, but there are some places in the Salish Sea as well, Lummi Sea Pond, Drayton Harbor, Padilla Bay, a few other locations as well. Basically anywhere they are, we're trying to bring those numbers down. And lastly is long-term monitoring. The goal here is to try to assess changes in the community over time. So we will set up traps and keep consistently trapping at the same locations every so often, say like once a month or a couple times a year, and keep doing that over and over for years and years in order to see trends over time. This will allow us to know a couple of things. One, how the community that's already there might change, and how our management actions may be affecting. So if we are monitoring and we're removing a bunch of crabs locally, and we see the green crab numbers in monitoring are going down, that may suggest that we're being affected. If we're doing monitoring at a location, green crabs show up, and then we notice that a certain species starts to be less common, we might suspect that the green crabs are impacted. This is basically happening anywhere we can possibly do it that's of interest. The only caveat is we have to be able to go consistently and put in the same amount of effort over and over again. You can't do long-term monitoring one time. You have to do it over and over again for as long as possible. So to give some context, this is a map I made for 2023. Those dots represent approximately everywhere that green crab trapping occurred. Obviously, it's very broad, like a certain location like this dot represents like 15 different locations. Anywhere that is red, I should note, is where green crabs are present. Anywhere that is blue is where sampling occurred that year and green crabs were not detected. It's really informative for us to know where green crabs are, but it's also important for us to know where green crabs are not. And I should say, in last year, we caught about 360,000 green crabs statewide. That was over 176,000 traps that were checked. And a trap check is you literally pull up the trap, you look what's in there, you take out the green crabs, you put everything we like back, you put it back in the water, there you go. And over 150 locations statewide. And this year, we're only more locations, more crabs, more everything's happening. In terms of where the green crab actually are, of those 14 management areas I pointed out earlier, 11 of them have green crabs. The only ones that don't are South Central Puget Sound, South Puget Sound, and South Coast. South Coast is essentially one long beach and is not really conducive. To be clear, though, we've never really looked that hard for green crab here because it looks like a terrible place for them. So take that with a grain of salt. I will say, though, like places like Hood Canal, North Central Puget Sound, these we have detected green crabs, period, but the numbers are pretty low. We are still doing monitoring and removal efforts and things like that. We're taking their presence seriously, but it's not on the same scale as what we see on the coast. To give you some context, I showed you that graph up to 2021 earlier. This is the rest of that graph. We have the year, the Salish Sea branch, the Pacific Coast branch, and the total number of green crabs per year. So as you can see, 2022, these bold numbers, this is when the emergency started and there was a lot larger influx of money and labor. There's a couple of things to note. One is the number of green crabs being removed each year is going up, which could be a good or bad thing depending on how you want to look at it. But really interestingly also is that for the Salish Sea, the number has actually gone way down the last couple of years. This is primarily driven by the Lemmy Sea Pond is a very interesting place. It's sort of a bowl in a way that larvae can be retained, and so it's been a really great place as an incubator for green crab population. But that's also given us a really targeted place to remove them. And so the Lummi Nation, with assistance from WDFW and others, has really put in a ton of work and really hit it hard. And so that's what's brought down those numbers so strongly. Just to give you some context, so this graph represents all the green crabs removed from North Puget Sound from August last year to August this year. The little circle here shows, the orange circle just shows where I'm talking about on the map. Any triangle represents the number of green crab removed, and the little box with the X, which I think kind of looks like a trap, is the number of traps that were checked. And so you can see the numbers were much higher in, and the color represents season. So orange is fall, green is spring, summer is yellow, and blue is winter. You can critique me on my color choices later if you want. But the point being is we've seen a steady decline over time. We have gotten a little bit of a peak here this year in this last month, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But overall, this is a decline. Again, this is primarily driven by the decline in the Lemmy Sea Pond, but it is optimistic because it's showing an actual impact of trap. In the north coast, this is where the Macabre Bay Indian tribe territory is and their nation. And they do all the trapping there with a little bit of support from WDFW, very similar to what Lummi does. And they've done an excellent job. You can see that they had a lot of green crab removal in late 2022, but they've really been bringing down those numbers over time, even with some greater trapping effort. Again, they have had kind of a back to what we saw before this summer, but again, there's a reason we think this is happening, which I'll explain in a bit. And then Willapa Bay. Willapa Bay is the location with the greatest number of green crab in the state. And you can see there are these highs and lows. One thing that's really important or interesting to note is that in general, green crab numbers go down, Green crab numbers go down in the winter. Some of this is due to decreased trapping efforts because it's not as safe. I will say people do still trap in the winter and catch crabs. But part of it is the green crabs just aren't as active and it's not as easy to capture them. They are cold-blooded. And so when it's cold, they stop moving as much. And so the temperature can really affect how effective trapping can be. Once again, though, the unfortunate thing about Willapa Bay is we are still seeing increases year by year of green crab. And again, in particular, this last month. Now, you probably saw the slide I accidentally showed you, which I'm trying to accidentally show you again. There we go. So those of you who may know, we had an El Nino year. And so what that means is we have an influx of warmer water coming up from the south. So normally in the winter, we get cold water that heads north. Green crabs, some of them can survive that transport. They have made it north, but they do so much better when it's an El Nino year and we see this warmer water. There have been peaks in green crab recruitments across the coast. I'm talking about California and Oregon and Washington and British Columbia. Every year there's been an El Nino event on record that we've looked for this. So every single time we see really good green crab, really high green crab recruitment. And so it's not surprising that we saw it this year as well. Our hope is similar to past years. We'll see those numbers go down again when that recruitment is not as high, but we won't really know what's going to happen until it happens. I will say that even if it doesn't, this is still a concern, and there have been efforts to ramp up trapping, particularly in the Salish Sea, where green crab numbers are really low because of this higher recruitment. We want to keep green crab numbers down as much as possible. And I thought you might actually want to hear about some actual work that's being done outside of trapping. So this is a recent study that's been published by Mary Fisher. She was at the University of Washington, and she was working with Washington Sea Grant as well. She did what's called a DNA metabarcoding analysis of the gut contents of green crab. So she went out, sampled a bunch of green crab in Willapa Bay, half of them on manila clam beds and half of them off. And she assessed the DNA that was found in their stomach to see what they've been eating. I want to be clear that what she found can only tell us what was in the gut contents of those particular crabs at the time she did this study. It doesn't say absolutely everything that's going on, but it's still really informative. So for example, even though half of the crabs were collected on manila clam beds, only one green crab had manila clam DNA in its stomach. What does that mean in the large run? Well, we know that the green crabs can eat them, and we also know that it's not the majority of all of their diets. So that's something that's helpful. In terms of Pacific and Olympia oysters, she didn't find any evidence of it in their guts. We know they can eat them. The question is, was the test actually capable of detecting it, or did they not eat anything? That's a little unclear. There's a similar phenomenon with mussels. You can't use this particular test to check if they ate blue mussels, but we assume they probably did because they eat them when we can find them. Interestingly, 3 of them had Dungeness crab DNA in their stomach. I should point out that those crabs were also caught in traps with Dungeness crabs, and it's impossible to tell if they ate that before they got in the trap or while they were in the trap and were hungry and there's a Dungeness crab, so it's either. But again, still informative, and it can be the basis of further investigation. Another study that was done, it's still in prep, but by Ben Rubinoff, who is a postgraduate or postdoctorate with the Washington Sea Grant. They did a study looking at green crabs and how they're impacting local species. Basically, what Ben did was they looked at the trap data that had been collected over years to see if there was any correlation between green crab abundances and other species. And they found that in general, as green crab abundances go up, we found less hairy shore crab in the traps, you found less staghorn sculpins, you even found less Dungeness. And so again, there's this implication that maybe there is an impact going on. He also did a study that's pretty, the technique is pretty common, but it's also sort of tragic and hilarious, is that you tether hemigrapsis, the little hairy shore crabs, and you put them out in the wild overnight. And if they're alive when you get back, then you know they're fine. But if they show they've been predated upon, which is usually part of the carapace is left and been peeled off, they've been eaten, and you compare that to green crab abundances in traps nearby. So what they found was that there really do seem to be clear relationships between green crab abundance and hairy shore crab mortality, which again has been something that's been done. I did a similar study for a different location as well, but this has been and I'm not trying to say this is not a worthwhile study, because there's very few projects like this that have been done in Washington. And so we need to know what's actually happening here as opposed to inferring from somewhere else. Lastly, in terms of interesting science that's going on, you might think that the European green crab, it is one of the most prolific invasive species globally. No one's actually mapped or sequenced its genome. Part of this is because it takes time and money. The other part is actually crabs have messy DNA. There's a lot of redundant kind of junk DNA, and it's been really difficult to do this. There's actually only 5 crab species that have had their genomes mapped. And so our unit actually was contacted by Representative Joel McIntyre. He's the representative for the 19th Legislative District, which includes Olympia Bay and I believe all or most of Grays Harbor. And he was very interested in finding new tools for us to utilize to deal with green crabs. And so he heard of this project called this technique called gene drives, which is this thing where you can force sort of heritability of negative genes into you basically can force heritability of 100% of a particular gene, and you can make that gene deleterious. However, we said that can't be done unless we have this genome, and even then it might take decades to get something useful. But he was, to his credit, I want to say, he was like, all right, that's what we got to do. That's what we got to do. And so we're starting from step 1. We've already got the samples that have been started for the processing, and we'll be undergoing analysis soon. And once that genome is mapped and annotated, it'll be made publicly available worldwide for free. So like you can go online now and actually get the zebra and quagga mussel genomes if you want. You can just have it if you want. And so by making it publicly available, that will allow others to try and pursue techniques and technologies that might help us in the future. There we go. Now, as we're I'm a little behind, but I'll make this quick. How can you all get involved? And we like people involved. So first, I want to say that if you see any crab, any molt, anything that you suspect might be a green crab, just let us know. I will say that depending on where it's from, anywhere between 10% to like 60% of the reports we get are false positive, or like people say it's a green crab, but it's not. But we still want to know. So what we ask you to do is to take detailed pictures, make sure that we have the location where you think you saw the crab, and you can report it to WDFW in a couple of different ways. You can use this link here. You can email us at ais@dfw.wa.gov. You can call the hotline, or you can use the Washington Invasive Species app. And so people send us the picture, we look at it, we determine what it is, we let you know. If it's a green crab, we may go out and check it out. If it's not a green crab, we're just happy to know about it. No bad time to test this. But there are some volunteer opportunities for those of you who want to get out in the field and actually do something. The most intense of the two is you can join Washington Sea Grant's crab team. They have a statewide monitoring program where there's specific locations throughout the state. You go out once a month from April to August, you deploy traps overnight, you recover them, you collect the data, they'll train you. It's a great excuse to get out and do something. I will say that a lot of the places where green crabs are kind of muddy and not the easiest to walk in, but if you're down for that adventure, it's fun to get out and do. If you're looking for something a little less commitment heavy, a little less muddy, there's also the new molt search program. What they do is they train you to go do a 20-minute walk along the beach, looking and recording every single molt you see, take those photos and submit them. And if they're green crabs, they'll be identified. If not, it goes into the record on native crab molt's location. The mults don't necessarily tell us that a green crab is right there, right that second, but it's certainly more likely that they're nearby if we see those mults. So I'm not going to read you all this because that's a lot. This one's one of those, take a picture. But I do want to say that there are a lot of resources available to those who are interested. First of all, you're always welcome to email me with any questions. You can also contact Chase Gannell. He's our communications manager and green crab public information officer. You can also email our regular website as well, email address as well. In terms of resources, there's the green crab webpage. There's also this new site, the Green Crab Hub. This is a really great place if you're interested in things like catch numbers, activities going on in specific locations, getting into the real nitty-gritty of the emergency. And we keep that up to date all the time. Then there's, again, the reporting form. And if you want to get regular updates, we also have the email list so that you get I believe it's monthly update just on what the situation is. We do public reports every 2 months that are just kind of outreach in general about what's going on. But if you want the real nitty-gritty, tell you a secret, there is European green crab quarterly progress reports. These are written and submitted to the legislature every 3 months as part of the emergency to let them know what's going on. It outlines what WDFW is doing, what we're spending our money on, how the emergency is going, but it also highlights activities by other co-managers, tribes, and partners. We request them to submit addendums to say this is what we're doing, and it kind of gives a generalized overview of what's happening. And very recently, I'm talking last week, we just published the European Green Crab 2025 to 2031 management plan. And if you're wondering why it's 6 years instead of 5, it's because funding is biannually in Washington. And if you want to see these, they're at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Publications. If you just search that, you'll find them. I will also say it is my job to write all of these. And I go a little crazy sometimes, which is why it's nice to come out and see all of you. The management plan is literally longer than my dissertation. So I do, again, want to make a real point that green crab management in the state is not a WDFW solo affair. We do have authority and jurisdiction within state land, but Washington is not just state. It is home to many tribal nations and other and federal government land. And so I want to really give credit to those who are involved. There are over 40 groups and governments involved in the work we do. And seriously, everyone puts a lot of time and effort, and it's really a collaborative process. And all of these co-managers, tribes, and partners also contributed to that management. So everybody sat down with me and had long discussions about what that thing was. I just want to thank you. Last, I just want you to remember one thing. If you remember anything, is that green crabs are an emergency in Washington and beyond. It's not just our land, but that a lot of Washington isn't invaded yet. And so there's still hope for getting effective work done. Even in places where they are established, there's still a lot we can do. And if you find one or think you find one, please just let us know. We want to know what's happening. And with that, any questions?
You're doing this research for the crab, and you also find it pollution and other things like that in contaminated areas. Did you write that up in the process of looking for the crab?
No, I mean, we do some water quality assessments as we're doing this, but that measures things like temperature and salinity and dissolved oxygen, things like that. It doesn't measure levels of contamination by pollutants.
Is your target area the tidal zone or?
Yeah, these tend to be what we consider an intertidal or a high tidal crab. They can go into deeper waters up to a point, but they are readily consumed by things like red rock crab, larger Dungeness. So they're not invincible. They tend to be where they're safe, but it's really scattershot. They like structure, so they like everybody. And they like going near things like pilings or riprap. So riprap's just rocks and things on the shoreline. Eelgrass, they also, that's one of the reasons why they often are found also with aquaculture, is not necessarily because they're consuming it, but because it creates nice structure that's protected for honestly anything. But yeah, most of the trapping initially was done in the state on land, or by land, I should say. So we'd walk out there with a bunch of traps, deploy them, and come back. But lately, there's been a greater emphasis to boat deployment of traps, and that's been really effective in areas. But again, they're not going quite as deep as say like the Dungeness.
I'm just wondering if they have any commercial viability or if there are any benefits at all. It sounds like there's net really no bad environment in everyone, but
Yeah.
is there anything that's good about it?
No, it's a good question, and I do want to say, like, I actually have a soft spot for them because they're just critters doing their thing. But the bottom line is, we want to protect the resources that are here and important to us, and that means dealing with them in a unfortunately aggressive way. I will say that, you know, you can't eat them. I got tired of people asking me if you could, so I did. They taste fine, but there's not a lot of meat on them. In their native range, they're actually part of kind of like their local cuisine, because, you know, back when you had to eat what you could, even though they aren't the most meat to work ratio kind of species, you'd eat them anyway. You can eat soft shell crab, you can make broths and bases in them. On the East Coast, they also sell some whiskeys based with some of it in it. It's not very good, but it sells out because it's a niche thing. And so there has been discussions of other uses. So for example, we donate sounds. We have a relationship with a fertilizer company in Willapa Bay, and they graciously accept our green crabs and bait as fish waste, and they process it into organic fertilizer for use. It's called Pacific Grow. That's the product itself. And it's really great of them for their contributions. However, at a certain point, like, you know, we can't sell it to them because they have more than stuff than they need. But there has been talk about things like trying to process them into a liquid protein for use in, say, like supplements or cat food. There's also been discussions over time about turning their chitin into plastic. There's some researchers on the East Coast that are trying to turn it into a bioorganic plastic. I really don't know much about how that works, but it's an interesting take. And then you can just use them for compost too. In fact, the exoskeletons can shred up nematodes, and so if you grind them up and use it, it's been very effective as pest control as well. So there are some beneficial uses, but unfortunately, there's not that really common popular fishery for them. Yeah.
For conservation plans, is this for, are you going for just eradication or total eradication?
So total eradication would be great, but unfortunately, for the most, generally speaking, with invasive species, that's not feasible. There are certain circumstances where it's really spatially isolated and they're not a super mobile species. So like the most successful ones are like goat invasions on small islands and things like that. There may be circumstances where that's potentially possible. Functional eradication, and so for those who don't know, functional eradication means bringing the population down to a point where they're there, but they're not really having that much of an impact. That's kind of what we're aiming for. The reality is even functional eradication is kind of it's a somewhat nebulous goal because we're not entirely sure what they're doing and what that level would be. Right now, the goal is to simply suppress the population as much as we can. Ideally, we'd lower them to a point where between those reductions and maybe other defenses like netting for aquaculture or other procedures, we could reduce or eliminate the impacts. But at the moment, it's basically just trying to get as many as possible. Yeah.
Assuming the worst, what would be the projected worst ecological impact and the worst impact on human society if they were just allowed to grow and check?
That's a really good question. So it's also kind of difficult to answer. Part of it is just because it's a very big and good question, to be fair. But also, a major problem with invasions ecology, the study of this stuff, is that we don't often have a solid baseline. So like nobody's out there doing monitoring before this happens, so we can see what we're losing. The reality is we start to assess it after we start to lose it. I would say, and again, I don't want to pigeonhole into a specific number or something like that, but I would say they could have some significant impact on native species and economically important species. And in terms of like that's kind of what we see is there's this sort of a shift where they become more abundant, some other species become less abundant. It might change the circumstances of how like eelgrass beds are distributed, how these crabs are distributed. It's really hard to say, other than it won't be sort of what people historically associate with Washington and what people kind of want to preserve about Washington, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much work has been done looking at their effect on purple short crab.
Oh, yeah, no, those little guys always get ignored in the whole trade-off. So for those of you that may not know, the purple short crab, if you ever walk down to the beach and see a bunch of crabs that are like, run away, that's the purple short crabs. They're Pachygraphis crassipes. They're much more of a high intertidal species. As far as I'm aware, there's not too much overlap because they're so much higher. I'm assuming a green crab would eat them. But in general, I think the impacts are relatively minimal. But I should say, though, most of our information about the impacts of green crab come from trapping. And so we aren't catching them as much because they're higher in the intertidal. So I will conservatively say there's probably some impact, but not disastrous.
But like, there hasn't been the same kind of like detailed studies looking at them as with.
Yeah, there just isn't quite the same habitat overlap. And again, like if it gets real, if they're being chased, they could always just like run up the limb. So again, I'm sure that there is something happening, but no one's really put as much effort because it's less like they're headed in strong direction.
Question.
What about these?
Do we have any idea how ocean acidification is affecting European green crab?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to go too out on a limb here because I'm not as well versed in that particular topic. I will say that they will be. So green crab are going to suffer impacts from things like climate change, so increased temperatures, ocean acidification, stuff like that. We know this. The thing is, because of their higher tolerance for a lot of conditions, we expect that it might not impact them as negatively. But again, it's hard to say exactly. So for like ocean acidification, I'm sure that will reduce, they'll increase mortality of larvae and things like that, but I can't say specifically what it will do, other than it will have an impact of some sort. Okay. Don't worry. Local predators, it's just it's in their evolved system. Parasites are another thing too. There's been research that's shown that the parasite load of green crabs in North America is far lower than in their native range. So when invasive species are introduced to a new area, one of the reasons they tend to do better, or can do better, I should say, it's not universal, is that they don't have to deal with the same predators, they don't have to deal with the same competitors, and they don't have to deal with the parasites and diseases that were there. And so it just makes it a better situation for them, and it provides an opportunity for them to expand and grow at a greater rate.
You have a solid mention.
Yeah.
Is that something?
Oh, yes.
Used?
Yeah, so again, for those who might not be familiar, eDNA simply means environmental DNA. So essentially you can take a water sample and check that for any sort of floating DNA material. So waste material, organic other tissue that might be in the water, and you can see if the green crab are there. There is work being done in Washington. We do some green crab eDNA monitoring. The thing about it is it's not a tool that's at the point where we could use it alone. So like if we're doing sampling and we detect green crab eDNA, that's not, oh my gosh, green crab are here. We need to look closer to see if they're actually here, because we've done things like literally taken a eDNA sample like near to a trap that had green crabs in it and got no green crab eDNA. We're talking about a very dynamic system, and so it's really hard to kind of piece it together. One way it's being used, though, that's really interesting is Carl Osberg, who's a researcher with United States Geological Survey, is using samples with larvae in it, and he's taking eDNA samples from that. So essentially, you could have a water sample that you collected larvae into, and instead of processing the whole thing to identify each larvae and see if any of them are green crab, you could do an eDNA test on that sample and see if there's any green crab DNA. And so that might be a really effective use of it, but it's still kind of a work in progress.
Maybe this is silly, but in the slide where you're talking about they saw what the 86 crabs they caught eating. And you said one of them had vanilla, and 3 of them had Dungeness. What were the rest?
Yeah, so I should point out that most of them had more than one thing in their gut contents, right? So it's a variety. The majority of them had red algae, oddly enough, which they can eat algae and they will sometimes, but it's thought in this case it might be more of a byproduct of their feeding than like the direct feeding. Otherwise, it was things like hairy shore crab, I believe sculpins were another one. So the stuff that In the trap assessments, they had highlighted as something that there was a negative correlation between green crabs, like the more green crabs you get, the fewer shore crabs and sculpins you got. So it made sense that they were consuming those sorts of things.
Yeah, going to ask a dangerous question here. Is one of the methods for control with issues and drawbacks and legislative obstacles any thought into biocontrols?
Yeah, so the two that are kind of the most commonly brought up on that topic of like, why don't we do this? Biocontrol is one, and the other is the use of pesticides, right? Pesticides right now, there's several reasons why it's a complicated issue. The primary one, though, before we even get into like how do you effectively apply it and all that, is it's actually illegal to use the ones that are most common, would have been used most commonly because of their impacts on other crab species. So that kind of is if we're going to kill Dungeness by deploying this stuff, it's not really an ideal thing. It doesn't mean there might not be some circumstance or maybe something found in the future might, but for right now, that's really not an option. For biocontrol, that one's complicated too, because so for those who might not be familiar, biocontrol is the use of another organism to control essentially the invasive species. So there's some classic examples that are pretty disastrous, like introducing. So yeah, if anyone's ever seen that episode of The Simpsons where the toads eat the corn stalks and things like that, that's not too far off from what actually happened when crabs or toads were introduced to control beetle populations in Australia, except for they're not even before. For here, for biocontrol to be effective, you need a species that will basically exclusively impact this target species, right? So you don't want a generalist predator like a bird or a frog or something like that. And it also has to be something that's going to really hit the population hard. Biocontrol won't ever eradicate something, but it can bring the numbers down. And so like it's really like an effective thing is like a parasite where it only targets that particular species. There has been some preliminary work done looking at green crab and a parasite. Unfortunately, that parasite also infested the native crabs as well. So it's again, it's like if it's going to be released and it's going to target everything, that's not really ideal. It's possible, but I'm hesitant to say that we will come up with any sort of solution for biocontrol. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be considered, but it's not something that there's at this moment there is nothing on the table that seems like a viable option.
Thank you.
What sort of measures are being taken in terms of balance? We have South Central, South Puget Sound that have container ship traffic and other large ships passing through. Is there more enforcement of the ballast water management with these ships?
So 2 points. One, our major concern in terms of ballast water transport for green crabs is within like the Salish Sea, like so if you move from like north to south rather than say, and I'm not saying that's what your question was specifically, I just want to make this point that it's more local travel as opposed to like if something comes in from overseas, it comes in for green crabs specifically. There are ballast water regulations and different technologies that exist to help manage that. I will punt that question to my colleague Amanda Newsom, which you can ask her after, because she is our ballast water lead at the unit, and she can give you a much better answer than I can, other than to say that it is something we are concerned about and we're discussing. It's hard to deal with in some ways, though, because let's say we decide that a new rule needs to be enacted specifically to deal with green crab. We have to find the political and like power to push through more legislation, so we better be sure it's actually going to have a really significant impact and actually be a real benefit, as opposed to like if it changes it from like 0.01% to 0.09, you know what I mean? Like just like the tiniest fraction, it's probably not going to be beneficial and worth the long push. Yes.
Is there any coordination or data sharing with other agencies like Oregon or Alaska or WDFW? And if we are the cutting edge as far as doing the work, are they wanting to know how we did it, and, you know, is there any sort of like scaling up of what we're doing locally in Washington? Is that,
No, that's an excellent question. So we do collaborate a lot with other entities. So in fact, this afternoon, I had a meeting about how to do estimations of green crab populations with representatives from Alaska and Oregon and California and British Columbia. So we do have really pretty strong communications with our partners up and down the coast. We're trying to increase that even more so. I do want to say, though, that it's complicated because once you cross state lines, the rules and regulations are very different. So the status of green crab in Washington, as I mentioned before, is they're a prohibited level 1 species, which means you can't collect them or have them without permission. And the main reason is we don't, well, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the main ones is we don't want people killing the wrong crab. I will also say, though, if you find something and you're really confident it's a green crab and you're willing to take the risk, you can do with it as you will. But generally, we just ask people to take the documentation and return it. One crab is not going to destroy things either way. But that's not the case in most states. In fact, in Oregon, there is a legal limit. I believe you can collect 65 green crabs a day for harvest. They're not considered a prohibited species. They're just aquatic invasive species, which in Oregon is you need to report it. And in California, I believe there's no limit for catch and people can sell them and things like that. So again, it's a very different dynamic in these places. So
how would that affect your like, data? Does that affect your count? That's been taught?
So the numbers that we count are only those that are part of the formal emergency, rather than anybody reporting anything. If someone does report one, again, most people, we ask them just to take a picture and then return it, so it's not added to the catch, but it is a new location, or it may be a new location. We get a lot of reports of like, your green crab here, it's like, thank you, we know they're there, but we appreciate the notification as well. And so that doesn't affect the numbers.
Oh, I meant like in Oregon.
Oh, those numbers that we have are just Washington, they don't affect us at all, so.
Can you talk a little bit more about the remote search survey efforts and specifically for areas where green crab have not yet been detected or they're at low levels? What's been the participation in those areas?
So I can't say too specifically because that remote search program is run by the Washington State University Extension and Washington Sea Grant, who we work closely with, but that's not a program I have any. I know how to do the survey and I've done it for fun, just to see what I could find, but I don't know too much about what's going on. I do get like, you can sign up for like an annual, or not, sorry, like every couple of months report. I think it's called it has like a fun funny name, I can't remember right now. But to be updated in terms of what they detect. Participation, I think, is pretty good. Again, it's really low impact. It's something that like anyone can do as a phone and is just out on the beach. So, but in terms of what they're finding and what level of involvement, I can't say that.
Yeah, this is kind of a question about other states, so you may or may not have the information, but I've heard that, you know, in the like active management that, you know, one year down in California, they like did a really good job trapping all the adults, and then there was a population boom because the adults weren't eating the juveniles. And I was wondering how, you know, in places where members of the public can and do trap green crab, and I would assume mostly target adults, is the trapping by the public of a quantity that can risk having that kind of effect?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So just to reiterate, I don't know if the mic picks up things very well. So what's been mentioned in the question is I should mention I was there, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh,
So yeah, there's a location in California called Seadrift Lagoon. It's an artificial lagoon, a bit north of San Francisco. It's not very big. It's like maybe a mile long and like it's like maybe as wide as two of the libraries here. It's not a very big space at all. And it was essentially a fishbowl full of green crab. Like you couldn't walk a foot without stepping on them in the water. It was everywhere. And so it was considered a great place to do trial eradication because it's, as was brought up in an earlier question, you know, it's a nice isolated population. It had like a tidal gate, so that even if the tide outside in Bolinas Lagoon was down, the pond, the Seadrift Lagoon was still full. So there wasn't a lot of larvae leaving. And so what was going on is the effort removed as many green crab as they could, and just over and over and pulling them and pulling them and pulling them and pulling them. Because of the specifics of that location, there was not a lot of food availability, so there was really heavy predation pressure of the adults eating the juveniles. And once you remove those adults, the adults are the easiest ones to catch because most of the traps that we have are designed to catch larger crabs. If you do some specific things, you can catch smaller ones, but it's more difficult, generally speaking. And so it got to a point where the adult population was decreased enough that allowed a better environment for the juveniles to survive, and so that caused the population to have a boom. And that's something we call a compensatory response or overcompensation in this case. That is not, it's possible, and it was something that if anyone's interested, I wrote a paper about it in 2016. About that it was potential for this species because they have really high reproductive rates and they have a degree of pressure on their juveniles. But again, it was this really unique and weird system that like it would be really hard to mimic any other way. It's possible in other locations, but really, really unlikely. The closest place I could think of where it maybe could have happened would be Lummi Sea Pond, but we're not seeing any evidence of that. And Lummi Sea Pond is significantly larger than the place I'm describing. In terms of the harvest from the public, I don't have any fisheries numbers, or I don't think anyone is required to report numbers they harvest, but I'm willing to bet that the number of green crabs harvested by the public anywhere is really pretty low. As I mentioned in one of the earlier questions, there's not a lot of uses for them. Like you can eat them and you can do these things, but it's a lot of work. And so I'm skeptical that it would have any viable impact on the populations as a whole, least of all, not enough to cause overcompensation to it. We look for signs of this potential response, but honestly, we don't see it anywhere. And again, it's possible, but really, really unlikely. Thank you. Yeah, no worries.
Oh.
Yep.
Thank you, Brian.